I was amazed by Jim. For one thing, I didn't meet him until 2 or maybe 3 weeks after I'd been hired. Jim would only come to Toronto occasionally and sporadically. I guess maybe a week every month or something like that.
Okay.
And he'd be in town to oversee things or to direct an episode or sometimes to do one of his recurring guest characters on Fraggle Rock, such as Cantus or Convincing John. So I'd already worked a couple of weeks and gotten used to things. And one Monday morning, I walked into the studio, and there, sitting at the head of the table, around which we all sat every morning to read the script of the week, there was Jim Henson. And I'd actually never met a famous person before. I mean, I'd been working already for a couple of weeks with Dave Goelz and Richard Hunt. I do consider them to be famous people. But for some reason, Jim struck me on a whole new level of famous person. I'd never been in the same room as that kind of a celebrity. I'd never been in the same room as a celebrity before. And I'm just a kid. I'm barely 21 years old.
Oh, wow.
And I'd seen Jim, not only his characters over the years, but also the occasional interview. He's interviewed by someone talking about Sesame Street, talking about Kermit. He's talking about early interviews talking about The Dark Crystal, for example. And he always gives off a certain impression. I mean, Jim Henson was always Jim Henson, and you get an immediate vibe from him. And anyone who knows what I'm talking about knows what I'm talking about, that kind of gentle, bearded man. When I met him in person, that is exactly what he was like. He was, through and through, just himself all the time. Very calming to be in his presence. He made eye contact immediately with me. He offered his hand, and I shook it. And he called me by name the entire time that I knew him.
That must have been totally wicked.
It was totally wicked. I mean, here's one of my childhood heroes. I used to watch Sesame Street when I was just a kid as well. My grandmother also was there. That's why she made a frog out of an oven mitt for me, is because of Kermit the Frog. So to be on a first-name basis with one of my childhood heroes was surreal. And it was just so simple. Passing each other in the hallway, he'd say, "Oh, hi, Mike." And I'd be able to say, hi, Jim. I mean, my appreciation for that deepens as time goes on. I'm still actually kind of amazed by that. Labyrinth happened, like I say, summer of 1985. Jim Henson announced one morning. See, every Monday morning on the set of Fraggle Rock was the read-through day. That's where we all gathered around the table and read the script of the week. And one of those Mondays, with Jim Henson sitting at the head of the table, he gave us an update about his plans for Labyrinth. And again, I'd never heard of this. I didn't even know that he was planning a film called Labyrinth, but now I did. And his announcement that day was, "Oh, and by the way, we just secured George Lucas as our executive producer, and he's going to help us with post-production." Now, I'm spellbound. These words, executive producer, these words, post-production.
George Lucas.
And that big one, George Lucas. I'm a Star Wars kid. Of course I was starstruck by that. So Jim Henson, George Lucas teaming up to make a film. Oh my gosh, I have to be a part of that. So I bounced up to Jim Henson, probably with an energy, I'll flatter myself and say probably with an energy very similar to your enthusiasm, James. And remember, I'm a kid, barely 21 years old. I went bouncing up to Jim Henson after that, and I said, "Oh my gosh, Jim, I would just love to work on Labyrinth." And he took me up on that.
Okay.
He did not have to, but he did. One of his line producers, a man named Martin Baker, reached out to me not long after that, and we had a telephone conversation and a meeting, and we started making arrangements, and Henson Associates arranged for my work visa, and that summer I was flown to London, England to work on Labyrinth. Now, my involvement was short, and it was limited. So there we were, and we're in a room. I mean, I'll speak for myself now. I'm in a room with George Lucas, Jim Henson, and David Bowie all at the same time. How did I get here? It was certainly a magical time.
Jim was a quiet giant and a guy who quiet, very quiet, and to know him also on the 3D film too. One of his last projects, the Muppet Vision 3D.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the great stories I have with that is he was directing, and I was doing one of the little small world characters, and I was kind of off to the side a little bit.
Like in the finale?
Yeah, and as I was working, looking in the monitor, all of a sudden there was another little character behind me, and it was Jim. Jim had walked up from it and started playing, and we were playing together, and it was like, oh, it doesn't get much better than that.
For him to come up behind you like that, like, honestly, that sounds like something Richard Hunt would have done, really, from what I've heard about Richard.
Yeah, Richard was that way too.
Well, he was a lovely guy. I'm kind of shy, and he was Jim Henson, so he was infinitely approachable, and you could talk to him, and I did talk to him, but I didn't talk to him too much because I was just intimidated by the wonder of the guy. He was also fairly big, so he was a big dude. What was really interesting, he was just so inquisitive, so he was always asking questions.
Nice.
I remember being at a reception, and I don't know how it came up, but on the West Coast we have an expression about going snake, which is kind of to go crazy. And so he heard me say this, and he wanted a dictionary definition of what going snake meant. And it's just like everything he saw sort of perked his interest, and I think it perked his imagination, so he was always sort of creating, and he was just a very lovely guy, and considering the amount of stuff that was on his shoulder, very light and jovial.
Right.
You could see that at that time, part of the reason that Fraggle Rock was made was it was an experiment to see if there could be a show that Mr. Henson didn't have to be in the room 24/7. So he was there for part of it. He would direct sometimes, he played some characters, and then he would go off and he'd be flying around the world and
Right.
arranging Labyrinth and all the other things that were going on around that time. And when he would come back to Toronto and be in the studio, you could see that this guy was really, I don't know, tired, but he was traveling a lot.
He was a busy man.
Totally natural for the human body to go through. I feel extremely fortunate to have been in my small way, just close, and to see him work in a studio, to see him direct. As Brule, the bass player, he was Cantus, the flute player, so he was,
right.
We weren't even properly socially distanced for that stuff. So, I don't think I fully appreciated it at the time because it was my first gig. On one of those specials, it was Jim Henson's birthday.
Oh, wow.
I think he came in the next morning a little slow after his birthday celebrations and stuff. So, I think that was the 30th anniversary.
Two birthdays in one day.
Yeah.
Well, to me, it was a star. I just thought he was a genius, but he was basically a soft-spoken, very, very nice guy who would always listen to your ideas and that sort of thing. And he was willing to do it. And as a matter of fact, in the early days, he used to look at the drawings. He was the only one that could approve a sketch before it went into finish.
You mean like, do you mean like illustration drawings or puppet drawings?
Illustration drawings.
Okay.
Nowadays they have blue liners, they call them, right, which are evil people with blue pencils who go in there and mark up your drawings and fix them and make them more Disney-esque or whatever you want to call it. They've got this sort of more formal idea. Back then, Jim wanted everyone to sort of draw them their own. He wanted you to draw the Muppets your own way. He wasn't looking for a Disney-esque, everyone draw the same way type codified version. And but there were certain things.
Right.
And the thing that was very different from drawing the characters with Jim than with an art director later on. I mean, the art directors are wonderful and everything, but who can replace Jim Henson? These were his concepts. These characters existed in his mind, and the cartoon was almost as valid an expression of that character as the puppet. So you weren't really drawing the puppet, you were drawing the character the way he saw it. So that sometimes there was a limitation in what could be done with a puppet. And he'd say, well, don't draw it that way. I'd say, I know, Jim, but that's the way it looks on the puppet. Yes, but that's because we can only build him a certain way. But this is the way I see the character. So I got all these bad ideas in my head, which made me draw the wrong sometime by today's standards. You know.
Sounds like Jim really knew his stuff then.
Jim kind of knew what he was talking about. Yes, that's right. But it was fun to have that first-hand introduction to the characters.
Right.
That was unbelievable, really. For example, like Grover or Bert, they have these mouths that look, basically the head is kind of sliced like a melon, and the head opens up to work the mouth. And so from a full face point of view, he didn't want you to make the mouth go all the way around to the ears. So the mouth would be drawn inside that. He just thought that's the way it should look. And nowadays, of course, the art directors blue liners have you draw the Muppet the way it's made on the puppet, because they don't probably never talk to Jim about that, you know. Oh gosh, I have to tell you a great story.
Let's hear it.
In the early days, this would be like 1974. I think my daughter was 2 years old. She was born in 72. So I think it was 74. She was 2 years old. And I had a studio in the house, but I did not have a dedicated phone line at the time. And I refused to answer the phone, because the phone was always for my wife. You know, I didn't want to interrupt my work all the time to answer the phone. And my daughter spent a lot of time in my studio. So she was hanging around and the phone rang. And she picked it up and she was talking to somebody. I assumed it was a relative, you know. And she was laughing and having a grand old time. And after a nice long conversation, she said, Dad, the phone's for you. Phone, Dad. And I said, phone for me? Okay. I said, who is it? And she said, it's Ernie.
So it was Jim Henson.
It was Jim Henson. Yeah, he'd been doing Ernie.
Right, yeah. That's funny. That's cute, actually. That's very cute.
I had the pleasure of working with Jim. I think the first time I met him was in the recording studio, and I was singing backup for Caribbean Amphibian. Yes! And I had the honor of working with the original Muppet guys, with not only Jim Henson, but Richard Hunt and Jerry Nelson. Jim was a lovely man, and I met him a couple of times in the studio on a professional basis, and he was just so generous and supportive and kind.
Nice. Since you mentioned Caribbean Amphibian, I have a... It's kind of funny. I have a talking Kermit the Frog doll in my room. I don't have it right on the table with me right now, but basically if you squeeze it, it sings Caribbean Amphibian.
No way! I didn't even know people do that song! Caribbean Amphibian, that's alright. It's even hard to say now.
Yeah,
Well, I love that.
that doll is actually how that doll is how I used to wake up my sister.
Too much.
And you know, Jim had a had a very impish streak, which was kind of adult. He never really set out to create children's programming, and
Right.
he always appreciated. Well, when I say adult humor, I don't mean filthy stuff. I mean clever, and
Yeah, nothing like Happy Time Murders.
yeah, well, but that was clever, and
Oh yeah.
you know, I'm not saying he didn't enjoy a good dirty joke when it was well delivered. I'm just saying that children's programming was never his main thrust, but just about everything he did was extremely humanistic, you know, and expressed his love for his fellow man and woman, and spoke to, you know, greater truths about all of our humanities, and that's what spoke to me, you know. That's what I got out of it. So there were like 4 of us from the LA group who were chosen to do that, and I was like, oh my God, it was just really cool just being able to, number one, do these screenings and see the movie, and just to work, you know, in that small a group then with Jim. And then of course, just a month or 2 later, he passed away.
How did you feel when that happened?
I just disbelief. I was like, I really could not process it. And I know a lot of people had that same reaction. It just, he was such a young, vital, creative force. And
what was he like? I've heard so many wonderful stories about him.
He was fantastic. He never raised his voice. You know, at that time, I only got to work with him like for a week during the Muppet Vision 3D and during the subsequent screenings. So I certainly don't have the depth of experience with him that a lot of other people do, but I was always sort of in awe at his eye and his ability to pinpoint what works the best at any given moment for any particular scene and how to achieve it. He would always listen if you had an idea. 9 times out of 10, he would end up doing what he wanted to anyway, because his idea was usually pretty good.
He sounds like the kind of guy who would basically listen to an idea and take it, but at the same time would mold that into his own because he believed in his own creativity.
Well, yeah. Although I'll give you an example. There was one shot we were lining up where a bunch of these in Muppet Vision 3D, we had these this line of, like, they looked like toy soldiers.
Oh yeah.
Remember those guys marching around? And there was one shot where they're all lined up next to the cannon, and at one point the cannon goes off right next to them. And we were the blocking was choreography. We're just standing there while this thing goes off, just sort of guarding. And right next to me is Steve Whitmire, and so I say to Steve, Steve, shouldn't we be shouldn't I react? I'm standing right next to this cannon when it goes off, so shouldn't I, like, startle or something? I said, I don't want to just do it while we're rolling. Back then we were shooting on stereoscopic 70mm film. So when they rolled, it was expensive.
Holy crap.
2 70mm cameras rolling, and, so I didn't want to just do it. So I mentioned it to Steve, and he goes, oh, that's a good idea. So when Jim walked by, Steve very graciously said, hey, Alan had a great idea that that the puppet standing next to the cannon should just startle like that. He goes, oh yeah, Jim goes, "That's a great idea. Steve, why don't you get in that position and do it?" which taught me two things about Jim, which is that he's always happy to do something new that he hadn't planned on if it enhances his vision, and if it's funny. But number two, he always puts his best people forward. I was a lesser known quantity at that point, and he knew Steve's work, and obviously he'd been working with Steve for years and years. And so he said, "All right, let's put Steve in that position because I know he'll do it right." And then I'm like, "All right, at least." But to this day, you can see the film, and he jumps when it goes off, and I'm going, "Hey, that's my contribution."
Oh, he was amazing and wonderful. One of the most creative people that I've ever met or that ever lived in the last 100 years anyway. And he combined that with a brilliant business knowledge, and he recognized talents in other people. And he always celebrated that. A lot of people as talented as Jim, well, there aren't many, but people who are sort of as talented as Jim might be jealous of other creative people and try to compete with them. But Jim always wanted to collaborate with them and bring them into the Muppets. So some of the most amazing people that have ever worked together because of Jim. And that's one reason beyond Jim's own talent that all the Muppet stuff is so great.
Wow. Yeah, I've always heard that Jim, he would listen to people's ideas and he would put some of his best people on it if someone else suggested it. Like I was talking to Alan Troutman, who worked with Jim on Muppet Vision, and he was saying that he had an idea for Muppet Vision, and he told Steve Whitmire. So Steve told Jim, and Jim's like, "That's a good idea. Steve, why don't you do that?"
Yeah, well, he was very open to ideas. He had very strong ideas of his own, and he could be very stubborn if he disagreed with you, but always nice about it. But if he disagreed with you, you could be pretty sure that he was going to do it his way. But his way was almost always brilliant. And he was such a perfectionist. I mean, when we were doing records together, he might do 10 or 15 takes when you thought the first or the second one was just fine. But he would hear something and keep perfecting it till he got it even better than you thought he could. Though I play piano and sing, but Jim and others at Sesame Street, luckily for me, kind of liked the way I did that. But I couldn't do the puppets, so I was very honored that Jim himself did it. I mean, amazing. And the very first song we ever did together was Count It Higher, which you mentioned earlier. And Jim puppeteered my character on that, and Frank Oz did the other little character that was in that. So
You mean the little pink guy that was
the
in
little
that
pink
skit?
guy, yeah. So it was totally amazing that my first Muppet piece would have those two guys doing their magic. So that was the main thing. Even if you wrote a song that was not so good, by the time they were through with it, it turned out great,
So what was it about Jim Henson and Sesame Street and the Muppets that you think really, really influenced your design skills? Was it more with puppets? Was it with Jim Henson's animations?
To be honest, it was Jim Henson's generosity, because as a kid, learning how to draw and trying to learn different things and find different things, it was hard to understand the deeper things that were going on. Then in 1969, 68, 69, I think it was 69, Jim Henson produced a show called The Muppets on Puppets. I think it came out in 1970, but he did The Muppets on Puppets. He wasn't even really famous yet. He had, Sesame Street had just started when that finally came out. He made it before Sesame Street started. And he told all of his secrets, how he built them, who he worked with, how he did a sketch, and, the fabrics, everything. He just cut. And I said, oh my gosh, I was drooling over this thing. And I really wanted to learn more and more about everything he did. And as generous as he was, it was pretty easy to find. As the years went on, you find more and more things about how he did things and who he worked with and what his materials were. He was very generous. Well, I figured that must be all artists are like that. I went around looking and I couldn't find anybody else that was giving that kind of open information so freely and so completely. I mean, he would hold a little bit back, which kept everything mysterious, but for the most part, he laid out the foundation of his entire enterprise, which I thought was great. So because he was so generous, it just fed me and it made me realize, you know what, being an artist is part of a tribe in a way. And it started with Jim Henson. That's why to this day, you know, whenever I talk about anything about my work, and especially Sesame, but not only Sesame, I talk about Jim Henson because he's one of the most generous people in the world. And because, you know, everybody that I knew, I never got to meet him, but a lot of people said he would have loved you, Louis, which kind of is bittersweet in a big way. But they all say he was always easy to work with, and he'd bring people in and he'd give people an opportunity to work. His generosity is what really triggered everything in me, because it created an environment of freedom to know that this giant to me was still a humble person, and you know, showed his mistakes. You know, they showed outtakes and things like that. He was just tremendous, and because of that, it put me in a position of comfort while I was still struggling to get better, because I felt I could get better, because this man, as great as he is, he showed some of his flaws or some of the things that didn't work. And it made me say, no, don't worry about what doesn't work. Just keep going until it does work. That's what I got from Jim Henson. Anyway, we were doing a DVD cover called Silly Story Time. And it featured a lot of the fairy tale segments, you know, where Kermit was the reporter interviewing the characters from these famous fairy tales. And the thing is, of course, at that point, Kermit belonged to Disney, which was Jim Henson's intention. A lot of people feel really bad about that or uncomfortable with it, but it was his intention, you know, to sell to Disney. So anyhow, well, not to get into all that stuff, but anyway, but Disney owned Kermit. So we said, you know what, Kermit is in every single one. The only Muppet that's in every segment is Kermit. We got to see if we can get him for the cover. So I said, well, yeah, we should try to do that. So, you know, we reached out and to Disney, and they said no immediately. They said, no, Kermit belongs here now, and, you know, we don't want to confuse the market. I didn't like that answer, because Kermit he didn't start on Sesame Street, but he became really famous on Sesame Street. So I said, you know what, let me try again. I must have written maybe 3 or 4 letters. The last one I got back was from the lawyer saying, we will not release Kermit the Frog to you, please. You know, it was sort of a cease and desist letter, but it wasn't like, you know, a big, heavy legal cloud. They just told me I was never going to get Kermit the Frog. They did not want to confuse the market, because the movie, the actual first new Muppet movie, was going to be coming out. I think that.
Yes. That was an awesome movie.
You like? I'm such a purist that there are things about it that made me feel a little reticent, but you know, but it was still great to see them back. That's for sure. Anyway, so I felt bad because we were going to try to have to do the DVD cover without Kermit. And I said, no, this doesn't make any sense. So I wrote one more letter, but this time, instead of making it some professional letter, I wrote it by hand. And I went to Henson and said, look, you know who at Disney can take this letter and give it in the right hand so that somebody will hear what I'm trying to say. We're not, you know, there was a big span of time between when our DVD was going to come out and when that Muppet movie was going to be released. So I said, there won't be any problem. And everybody knows Kermit, you know, was made famous on Sesame Street. So anyhow, I gave a letter and I said, you know, I'm probably not going to get any progress with this, but I had to try because it really meant a lot to me. So normally I don't, these days it's different, but normally I don't check my email, my work email on weekends, but it happened to be his son's birthday that day. So I got home, and after we took him to his favorite restaurant, I said, you know, I got to check. Maybe I got a word about Kermit. I hope it's a good word. When I opened the email, sure enough, they released Kermit to say, yes, you know, we understand now there's going to be a big difference. I forgot exactly what it was. I have the letter somewhere, but they said, you know, we're going to release Kermit to you and you can use him for this thing. So I was really excited about that. So the day came. Now we were doing a 2-day shoot. The first day was on Thursday, and we were doing a shoot for another DVD. But Kermit was going to be arriving that day so that we could do the photo shoot on Friday. So we were waiting for Kermit to come, and he didn't show. He was supposed to be around 3 o'clock. No, about 1 o'clock. So 1 o'clock came, he didn't show up. But again, FedEx, who knows, things can happen all the time. 2 o'clock came, no Kermit. 3 o'clock came and no Kermit, and we were starting to get a little concerned. And the art director, his name is Len Forgione, he was actually the art director back then who did the design on the cover. He was kind of getting concerned because it was his idea to ask, and he felt really bad. So I said, no, you know what? It took a long time and a lot of work to finally get approval to use him. I know he's going to show up at some point, but that wasn't enough for Len. He actually got up. We didn't even know when he got up and he left the studio. He went out to look for Kermit. Now, where in the world are you going to look? We called FedEx, and FedEx said, no, he was delivered. We delivered him. They didn't know it was Kermit. We delivered that package with that tracking number. So, well, where did you deliver it? He's not here. So, there was a bit of a panic, but I said, no, I know he's going to show up somehow. So anyhow, Len was walking around the neighborhood. We didn't even realize that, trying to see if we could find Kermit. About halfway down the block of the carriage house where we used to shoot was one of the Fox television stations. And they have this giant open bay where they receive all their packages because they get tons of stuff from FedEx. As Len was passing by there, he knew, not only a Muppet person would know, so you would know if you saw it probably, but anyhow, he looked and he saw a case that looked a little odd. So he asked the security guard, sir, could you please check the address on that particular box? And he went and looked and said, well, this isn't ours, this doesn't belong here. He showed him his ID. He was able to get the package and came back and was holding it up over his head like Hercules. So I found Kermit. We couldn't believe he actually found Kermit. So we had to shoot the next day, and it was one of the greatest days of my life because, again, when I was a kid, it was Kermit the Frog and Jim Henson holding Kermit, having Kermit on his arm that triggered me into this wonder world. And now to have Kermit in my hands, it was like a full circle experience that just, it's indescribable what that moment was for me. And there's a picture of me. I don't know if you go, I think we're Facebook friends, I'm not sure, but
Yep.
There's a picture on Facebook where you dig deep enough, you see me, I'm smiling and I think I'm holding Kermit's hands or something. And right at that moment, I said, nobody pinch me because I'm in my zone because I said, I'm with Kermit. It's got to be a dream. And then I said, wait a minute. This isn't a dream, it's real. Go ahead and pinch me. Everybody came up at once and pinched me. I didn't care because I was with Kermit the Frog, man. In his outfit, his hat, his the trench coat, his microphone. Oh, thanks for bringing that back, because I love telling that story because it just brings back such fond memories.
I have a VHS copy of, and I showed it in a Nostalgia Talk bonus video, as I call it, where I do these little sometimes it's like clip shows of past episodes. Sometimes I haven't done this yet, but I'm planning on bringing back past guests sometime for some fun, not an interview, but fun.
Right.
Or I'll just showcase something retro that I have. So I have a Kermit the Frog doll that I brought up when I was talking to Ivy Austin, and I thought to myself, oh, crap, I don't have it on the table with me. So I did a little showcase of it, and I showed tape I have, The Best of Kermit on Sesame Street.
Nice. Very nice.
Have you ever seen that one?
I think I actually have it, but not. I think they re-released it as a DVD, but not the VHS.
Oh man, I didn't know they re-released it as a DVD. I'll have to check that out. Now, were you there when they for the 50th anniversary special when Kermit was singing with Elvis Costello?
Sure was. I was on the set, man. I have to admit, my eyes were streaming because, again, so proud of Matt Vogel to step into the two of the most significant. Well, Kermit is the most significant of all the Muppets. But for him to step in and do what he was able to do, it just astounded me. But to be on a set when Kermit came back, I believe Cheryl Henson was there. I mean, it was a big deal. And they didn't let a lot of people on there, but I was grateful that I was allowed to be on there. And it was just a sweet moment. Because Elvis Costello, I had met him a couple of times before that, but he's a sweet man too. So all that coming together at that moment was just divine. Just divine.
The Hensons were were remarkable company, and they did some great stuff. I mean, what more can you say?
Yeah. Did you get to know Jim Henson before he passed away? Because he developed.
I met him maybe once. He died very soon after we started the show. Brian, his son, who I did get to know him better, but Jim, no, sadly. Actually, when I was in New York years ago, I was on a show called Free to Be You and Me. Marlo Thomas and the Muppets were involved with that show. It was one of the first things I did in New York. I was an extra. I mean, I was in the background, but I think Mr. Henson was there, and the Muppets were there, and Mel Brooks, he wasn't there, but he voiced some of the babies. So that's my relationship with the Henson people, Jim Henson. I sadly didn't get to know him, but Brian is carrying on his legacy brilliantly.
Well, and that's the thing about, I do remember this from Sesame Street early on, and it was Lefty. It was, hey, you want to buy an S?
Oh yeah, my dad loved Lefty.
My friends and I, we used to parody that. We used to act that out. I don't know how old I was, maybe 5 or 6, but older for sure. Because I think, the amazing thing that Sesame Street taught kids without them even knowing it was comic timing.
Oh.
When they watch Frank Oz and Jim Henson working off each other and playing off each other and ad-libbing and improvising and things. It's amazing. Did you happen to see the new documentary that it was just on, it premiered at Sundance virtually?
I tried to, but they wouldn't let me in because it wasn't available here in Canada. Even Emilio Delgado tried to help me out. Nothing.
Yeah, it was hard because it was I think it filled up quickly. They had a certain number that could actually watch it, which I thought was strange because I'm like, it's just virtual, right? Can't a million people watch it? And somehow it was limited. But it's really well done. And there's a moment in there. It's very, lot of great videos of John Stone talking about the early days, and Joe Raposo videos that I'd never seen. But there was a moment, because, we deal with curriculum all the time. That's the point of the show is, you want to teach and you want to entertain and you want to combine the two. And we always look to the past. I look to the past all the time for songs and think about how they would have approached things musically, educationally. And there's a moment where it's, Jim Henson is just doing something crazy with a puppet, and he comes down and he goes, "What are we teaching here?" and John Stone yells out, "Happiness."
Oh, I love that.
Boom, brilliant. We're just teaching happiness. And I think part of if you asked, Jim Henson or Frank Oz today, sadly we can't ask Jim Henson this, but I'm like, I'd love to ask Frank Oz, do you realize you were teaching them comic timing too?
I'll pass that along to Frank.
Because I think that's part of it too. I mean, why else would I mimic, "Hey man, you want to buy an S? An S!" Shh. Like
an
that.
S, right.
That's comic timing.
I started working up at NOLA because I had produced that record. So Jim Henson comes in and records some song. I don't remember what it was, but back then we were recording on a 24 track.
Okay.
2-inch multi-track. And the band would have recorded, and we would have had like 3, maybe 4 tracks open to record Jim. But then it would get to a point where they had a performance they liked and we're working on another track. And, when you pushed record, it's not like pushing record on Pro Tools now where we keep everything. And if you make a mistake, you can edit it and bring it back. When you pushed record, you were erasing something.
Oh.
For him to perform a one hopefully better. So he was working with Dave Connor, who I mentioned earlier, the vocal coach back then, who had Paul Rudolph's job up until Paul showed up. And Dave was in the booth with Jim Henson. And, they would say, we want to come in for this line and we want to save this line. So, punching in and punching out. And I really didn't interact too much other than they tell me what they wanted to fix. And I push record and get out, and you'd hope you didn't erase something that they needed. That was my concern. But finally they got through this one line and they got Jim Henson to sing the melody that was on the lead sheet. And I said, "There, you got it." And Jim Henson says, "Yes, I have it. Now I have to get Ernie to do it.
Oh, wow.
And it wasn't until Jim had said that to me, and I was probably 20, 25 at that point. But it wasn't until he had said that I realized, oh, these characters have character. You know, that Ernie sounds like Ernie and Kermit sounds like Kermit. And even though it's the same guy and there may be similarities, they really knew the difference. And that was really a learning point for me, because and the humility of Jim in the middle of all this, of saying, yeah, I finally got it, but now I got to get Ernie to sing it.
Yeah, I kind of see where you're saying, because, you know, on one hand you have all the fact that these puppeteers pretty much are their characters, but it's different identities.
Mm-hmm. And Jim was very humble. I mean, Jim wasn't the greatest singer or musician. You know, he relied a lot on Dave Connor back in those days.
Mm.
You know, to say, you know, they called Dave Connor's joking name was One More Time Dave. Because, you know, they do it and they go, okay, did we do it right? You go, oh, let's do it one more time.
Jim, yes. Jim was a very generous performer. He loved being upstaged. And Brian Meal was very good at that.
At upstaging?
I was a little afraid. I mean, Brian would, you know, I remember we were doing, you can see a little bit of it. It's in that 40th anniversary special.
Oh yeah, on the set of
Honker Ducky Dinger Jamboree. That's piece.
So hard to say now.
Honker Ducky Dinger Jamboree.
I love that song.
Not easy to make too. We had to figure out how we were going to do the dinger on the head. So no, as we were dancing around at the end, Brian came around from one side and went straight up into the camera and then off. And then he came around from another side, and I turned to Jim and he was laughing. He was loving it. So I was like, okay. So yeah, he, you know, there were times that I thought, here's a little anecdote. There was one time we were trying to figure out, with all the directors were putting their heads together about how to get a shot, and they wanted to have something that was going to pop down and hit a mark exactly. Okay. And they were kind of like, I don't know how we're going to do that. And then Jim said, well, why don't we just reverse the tape? And everybody went, oh, like little light bulbs went off over everybody's heads. And I realized too that I was looking at some very old footage from some of the early commercials that Jim made. The you know, the Wilkins and Wilkins
coffee, yes.
Coffee. And there was one that I was like, oh my God, he reversed the tape. So that moment on Sesame Street was nothing new for him. It wasn't an aha out of the blue. It was something he had done before, all the way back to Wilkins Coffee.
Wow.
Yeah, he innovated. He really invented television puppetry. You know, it was a whole new art form that he wanted a part of, whether it was puppetry or not. You know, there was lots of other directions that he went before he really settled on the puppetry.
I'm one of the few of Sesame Street who actually worked with Frank Oz and knew and worked with Jim Henson. So I got to be Jim's right hand for like Ernie a couple of times, and also was in scenes with Kermit when he was doing Kermit the Frog. So I'm very, very lucky, and don't take it lightly that I got to know and work with Jim.
It's amazing. I've got a photo in the actual edit. Noel, I know that you can't see it, but it'll be in the edit. But a photo that Cheryl Blaylock sent me of you assisting Jim in a segment called "The King Who Ate Only Chicken" that I talked to Cheryl.
Okay, first of all, I don't remember that, but thank God other people's memories, and I'd love to see that photo. I'm going to actually ask Cheryl for that photo, because I have a photo of me helping Frank, and I have a photo of me helping me with Richard Hunt.
Oh,
but I don't
nice.
have one with Jim. Oh, I also one with Jerry Nelson assisting him, but I don't have one with Jim. So I've definitely got to contact Cheryl.
It'll be in the edit of this video. So
Fantastic.
what was Jim Henson like? I've heard so many great stories about him. What did you think of him?
He was exactly as you wanted him to be. He was like, oh, was he so nice? Oh, was he so creative? Was he so sweet? Yes, he was. He was basically the boss you wanted to please. You wanted to get that smile from Jim. You wanted to get that little chuckle from Jim. He would more early on, before he became too busy, he would often like walk through the shop, the Henson workshop, the creature shop. And the people there are artists. They're true artists. They are amazing in the stuff that they can create. And you walk by their desk and he would like see something, he'd like, and he would like pick it up and kind of like play with it and maybe rearrange the eyes and all that. And I was like, and just like, and so from what I was told, often when he was available, before his schedule became busy, Jim would go by the shop at night, like walking through before going home, and he would see what people were working on, and then he would kind of like play around with it while they weren't there and rearrange it. So when they came back the next morning, they suddenly saw this character had like a different kind of expression or a different like hairstyle, and they realized it was Jim. So what I was told is they began to deliberately leave things out just to see what he would do and kind of speed the process of approval along.
So you assisted Jim with Ernie quite a lot, and as you were saying, sometimes you would assist Frank with Cookie Monster. Jim and Frank were really good at ad-lib. Do you have any stories of any times where you just cracked up watching them while you were performing with them?
Oh yeah, well, like there was one time when I came in to pick up something from the studio, and it was insert days. So there was like the street days where they do the street story,
right?
But then there would be a certain week for like 4 or 5 days when it would just be the insert. So it would be Ernie and Bert stuff, or Kermit and Grover, or Grover and Fat Blue in the restaurant, and it would just be all that stuff. So I came in one day to pick up something, and I saw they were wrapping up this bit where Ernie and Bert are in their apartment, they're in bed, and it's at night, and they're doing the bit, and they, the bit's done. But then Jim and Frank just kept going. They just kept talking. And, Bert even comments on the fact that Ernie, the bit's over. You can stop talking. Like, yeah, Bert, what is it? It just like keeps going. It's like you just want a close up. That's all. That's why you keep talking. Just try and get a close up. It's like, no, you get more close. No, Frank, no, John likes you better. And they just kept going, arguing back and forth about who gets more lines, who gets the close ups, who gets more fan mail. And they just kept going. My wife, Susan Elia McNeil, author of the Maggie Hope Mystery, is available on Amazon.com.
Link in the description.
Yes, The Hollywood Spy, coming out July 6th. She was at, she attended Wellesley, and there was a summer course that she attended at MIT. And at that particular summer, she walked by the auditorium with her friend, and she looked inside, and there was Jim and Frank sitting on stage, and it was the Puppeteers of America conference, and they were doing a presentation at MIT, and they pulled out Kermit and Cookie Monster on stage. And I think, again, you can watch this on YouTube because now it's available on YouTube. And Cookie Monster starts berating Kermit for the fact that he left Sesame Street to be a big time star and got the Muppet Show. Don't need us anymore. Don't have time for alphabet. And like, it just kept going on and on. And Kermit's like, oh, it felt like, so they had a great friendship that just translated into their characters. So the chemistry that Kermit and Miss Piggy had, or Kermit and Fozzie had, or Ernie and Bert had, that was based on the friendship and affection Jim and Frank had for each other.
I'm a huge Muppet nut. I mean, any of the regular listeners know that. And you were the voice of Baby Rowlf on Muppet Babies. Were you a Muppet fan before doing that show?
I was a huge Muppet fan before that show. That was my favorite thing to watch. Yes, I watched the Muppet Show every week, and when that opportunity came up, I made sure I was at the auditions and just thought, who could I be? Who could I do? And I loved Rowlf since I was a little girl, like 3 years old. So
Because Rowlf was one of the first big stars of the Muppets.
yeah, he was, but a lot of people didn't know what he sounded like, but I did, and
You do it well.
Thank you. He said a lot of people they knew Piggy and Kermit from the Muppet Show, but a lot of people, Rolf's kind of a guy who hangs out in the background, and that's how I am too. So our personalities are similar. He just enjoys being part of the crowd. He's just there, and that's how I am too. So we have similar personalities, although he plays the piano better than I do, for sure.
Yeah, Rowlf was actually first created for a dog food commercial, and I was talking to Jim Henson's biographer about a month ago. We were doing some talk about the Muppet Show, and he was talking about when he was big into the Muppet Show, and his mom had remembered watching Rowlf on the Jimmy Dean Show. And
yeah, me too. Yeah, me too.
Well, Brian had said that, Brian J. Jones, which is Jim Henson's biographer, he had told me that when his mom had said, oh, I remember watching Rowlf on the Jimmy Dean Show. And Brian's like, no, you didn't. Rowlf was on the Muppet Show first. But he didn't know that at the time because he was a Muppet Show kid.
No, I watched him on the Jimmy Dean Show. Yeah, that was my first memory. And it's Muppets, they're so fascinating. And it was just such a dream come true to be able to actually work with him and meet Jim Henson and have him come to our recording sessions. And, you know, that another idol of mine. I feel like I've had a star-studded career. I'm not being the star, but everybody else. And I've enjoyed being around them so much. And every time I went to New York, they weren't filming Sesame Street, but I can't tell you how many loads of laundry ironing I did watching Sesame Street, because I love Sesame. I love the whole concept, and the genius behind them just never ceases to amaze me.
I was wondering if you had met Jim Henson. What was he like?
Dear, thoughtful, kind, respectful, pretty quiet in our meetings. You know, just very gracious.
I had read that the first segment you ever wrote involved Bert and Ernie. A really funny segment, actually, for anyone who has never seen it. But it was Bert was saying, "Today we're going to talk about quiet and loud." So Bert starts off, "This is quiet," and Ernie's like, "I can't hear you." And then he keeps going, "This is quiet." And then it's like, "What's that?" And he screams, "This is quiet!" And Ernie's like, "No, that was not quiet at all."
That's loud.
Yeah.
Yes, that was my very first bit, the first segment I ever wrote. And if you can imagine the thrill of going into the studio and seeing the first thing you've ever written in your whole life performed by Jim Henson and Frank Oz, it's just unbelievable.
Were there any times when, because I've always heard that Jim Henson and Frank Oz were really good at ad lib and just playing off of each other. Were there any times where you were just watching them perform and then just died laughing?
Oh yeah, a lot. I mean, whenever they had the puppets on their hands, they were in character. They were never talking as themselves. They were always talking as Ernie and Bert, so long as the puppets were on their hands. If the puppets came off, then they could be themselves. But as long as they were holding the Ernie and Bert, they were talking as Ernie and Bert. And it was hysterical just to listen to them interact with each other. They were just brilliant, brilliant.
You know, Jim was absolutely legendary. And David, I did see a picture online of you with Jim Henson. Can you talk a little bit about what he was like?
Where did you see that picture?
It was on Facebook.
Photoshop. You photoshopped it.
No, that was me. That was me at like 12 or 13. I met him. I mean, it was a very brief encounter. It was obviously a very important moment in my life, but it was brief. He was very nice. I'm glad I got to meet him before he left us. Yeah, I mean, he's the reason. I don't think if he never did what he did, I don't know if any of us would be doing. I invited him to my bar mitzvah.
Oh,
and I got a response. Yeah.
Wow.
He sent back his response card.
What did he say?
No. He said he was going to be out of the country. I still have it.
I actually wrote him a letter when I was a sophomore in high school, asking how I could be part of the Rainbow Connection, to be, I had to like use the metaphor, I guess. And one of the most thrilling things that's ever happened to me was getting a letter back in response. And he didn't offer me a job in that letter, but it did encourage me to keep working in the profession and try to.
I love that.
Jim was like, okay, so you have to understand. I was I don't know, 24 years old, and I had never done anything. Like I had never done anything. I'd never been in a TV studio. So I think for the first maybe month, whereas everybody else in the studio called Jim, I called him Mr. Henson because I was terrified. And he never said anything until finally I got sort of relaxed or comfortable enough that I could call him Jim. And he was, for a young guy who didn't know anything, he was a little bit terrifying, but that's all my stuff. That wasn't him. He could be seemingly inscrutable. But he had a sense of humor. And I don't know how to tell this story because a lot of it was kind of from my perspective. But I remember one day on set when further along, I worked with him with the rest of the team for many years, and he knew he could by that point he knew he could sort of like poke me and that I wouldn't break down and cry, and so he had this sense of humor where I remember one time we were doing this group scene and we were surrounded by this set, so there wasn't a lot of room physically to move, and I had to make an entrance with my puppet, but it was so tight I couldn't get out of the shot. And Jim, he could have helped me out. He could have said, "Okay, well, let's move that set piece," and he just kept saying, "Oh no, you got to get out of the shot, Gordon." and I'd be like, "I can't. I don't have nowhere to go." Well, we're rolling, and you got to get out of the shot. And I mean, and he was cracking up, and I think everybody, if I remember, everybody was cracking up at me trying to somehow, I don't know, lean over backwards and get out of the shot. So he had this kind of what's the word? I don't want to say devilish, but really kind of he would kind of poke you a little bit, and this really nice trickster sense of humor, which was fun to be around. But a lot of, especially my early memories, are just being kind of in awe, and that was totally from me. That wasn't anything. And here's the thing, that wasn't anything from him, because going back to what I said about masks, I was so interested in masks, I started making all these masks. And at a certain point, I had a lot of masks. So I decided, because my parents ran an art gallery, I had the idea, well, why don't I do a show? Why don't I just do a mask show of them as pieces of art? And so I put it on, and it happened to be at a time when I knew Jim was going to be in town. So kind of as a joke, or not a joke, as a lark, I sent him an invitation. I'd made up these posters and invitations. Well, he came. After work one day, he and a bunch, and some of his, Steve Whitmire, and I can't remember who else, came to the gallery. And I was like, blow my mind. But that's the other thing about him, is he was always interested in other people's work. He was always interested in his performers. If they were doing other gigs, he was interested. And let me tell you, especially as a young performer, that is amazing. It's amazing support for you as an artist. If I go in, which I did, and I was a background to start, I was a background performer, and yet the boss, the Obi-Wan boss, is interested in coming to my little mask art show, that's a huge ego boost. It's amazing. It's amazing.
That is incredible. Wow. What a great story. When I was doing the show with the Lazy Town cast, David Matthew Feldman, have you ever seen Lazy Town?
I have not.
Okay, it was a kids show that combined live action and puppets, and David Matthew Feldman, who's one of the puppeteers, told a little story. He was saying that he met Jim Henson as a kid, just briefly, and then invited him to his bar mitzvah.
Sweet.
Mm-hmm. He didn't end up coming, but it was worth a shot.
And you know what? I mean, I think it's fantastic. I think it's fantastic, and I'll bet you that if Jim had been in town, he would have gone.
No, probably. So, David, if you are listening, just remember that.
Yeah.
Were there any times when you would be watching Jim and Frank performing not just Bert and Ernie, but in any skit, and you would just be dying laughing from their ad lib?
Always. Whenever they worked, it was usually between takes, or if they made mistakes. You'll see some of that in the documentary. There's lots of behind the scene footage in there, and you see them cracking up. They were so when they put those puppets on, they became those puppets. And so and they would say things that as the puppets to each other between takes.